Alright, so let's discuss the Henson stitch, because you'll want to understand this stitch before I go any further in my fursuit making process for the charity head I'm working on. The Henson stitch is an expansion on the traditional ladder stitch. For a refresher, I'll be performing the ladder stitch first. The ladder stitch can be performed on the right or wrong side of the seam. For clarity, we are going to show what the ladder stitch looks like from the right side of the seam or the front of the fabric. So we assume we are sewing something up from the outside and we don't want our thread showing. First we establish our anchor with the thread, and then we poke our needle through the fabric from the front, and then stab again so the thread is poking out of the front again, and pull through. Then we take our needle and poke it through the second piece of fabric, and we want to poke it directly across from the last hole our needle exited. Now we've created a straight line with our thread. We will continue going back and forth like this, always ensuring that we poke our needle in the spot directly across from the last hole our thread has exited. You can now see why this is called a ladder stitch, as this stitch creates a ladder-like pattern. Once I'm finished, I'm going to pull through all the thread, and ta-da! The thread is now hidden. But we can make that seam straighter, tighter, and stronger, and we can do this with Henson stitch. We begin by sewing a stitch in the same manner as we would a ladder stitch. But as we move into that next stitch, instead of inserting our needle straight across, we go backwards and insert our needle either into the exit hole of the previous thread or very close to it. Now we do the same thing on the other side, inserting our needle into or very close to where this previous stitch has exited. Today's episode is brought to you by the letter Z, which is the pattern that your stitch should create. And as I continue to stitch, you will notice a distinct zigzag pattern forming. Now I'm going to pull this tight. It's a bit more difficult to pull tight with the Henson stitch because of the stitch pattern, but once taut, our thread is hidden again. And with a bit of seam picking, we achieve a nearly invisible effect. Now I'm going to show you what this looks like as I sew naturally. I pull the thread taut as I go, because stitching a bunch of loose stitches and then pulling taut will most likely break your thread. The Henson stitch, also called the invisible stitch, was a stitch utilized by puppet master Jim Henson for the purpose of creating a durable seam that did not show up on camera film. The stitch, despite its magical name, is not truly invisible. No stitch truly is. But during the period of Sesame Street and The Muppet Show in the 70s and 80s, television had a film grain, or noise. With the help of the Henson stitch, the big seam down the center of Kermit the Frog's nose was virtually imperceptible on old television screens. I use this stitch because I use fleece on my fursuit heads, and in that way my fursuit heads are very much like puppet heads. With the right treatment, my seams become nearly invisible, which is enough for me. I would not say that this stitch is superior to the ladder stitch. It simply fulfills a specific niche that working with fleece requires. Working with fleece, I would argue, is the opposite of working with faux fur, because where fur can be very forgiving, fleece is not. Fleece has its own brand of unique pitfalls. But in other ways, it is easier to work with than faux fur and much more affordable. If you found this video useful, please drop a like or a comment. For additional questions, there is a frequently asked questions or FAQ in the link in my bio, and subscribe if that suits you. Thanks for watching.